Hello, it's actually a nice summery day here in northern Minnesota, so Merlin and I can sit outside and talk to you today about the topic of how to revive a language that you have forgotten. This was suggested to me by a number of people, and you might just be tuning in because you're a regular viewer. This might seem like it's potentially of interest to you, but actually I want to start off by making an assertion that if you're a native English speaker, or maybe a native French speaker, a native German speaker, you have, in point of fact, you personally have actually forgotten a language. You've forgotten a language so thoroughly you don't even know that you've forgotten it. And so we'll talk about that, what that language is that you don't even know that you've forgotten, that there is one in there. But most people, when they forget a language, they are aware that they're forgetting it. I think everybody's heard the expression use it or lose it. And that can be applied to, I guess, any number of other skills, but I think it's said most often of languages. The idea being that, if you learn a language and then you don't use it, you are likely to forget it or have trouble using it again after some point of time when you try to do it again. So is that true? Is that always true? It's often true. I think it's probably more true than applies more often than not. But there are circumstances that you need to consider when you think about if this is necessarily going to be the case. Obviously, the most important one is how long are you going without using a language? I think if you don't use a language that you've learned thoroughly, if you don't use it for 6 months, you're not going to have any issues. But if you don't use it for 6 years, you probably will. The issue is also this language, how long did you actually know it and use it? Is this something that you used for many years, or is it just something you kind of learned quickly and then maybe you immersed yourself in it quickly and then moved on from? Those will be different cases. I think how you learned the language is also very important, whether you just acquired it or whether you learned it systematically over a long period of time. And in particular, whether you learned it by using some of the quirkier methods that I've shown in some of my other videos, what I call polysthenics, or walking while shadowing, walking rapidly outside, because I think it's a given fact that when it comes to forgetting skills, we don't have so much problem with motor skills. So if you haven't ridden a bicycle for 16 years and then you try to do it again, it's not going to be an issue. But certainly if you try to speak a language after 16 years, it will. So maybe if you learn a language while you're in motion, you'll be less likely to forget it. Beyond these kinds of considerations, I think it's just a question of the individual mind. Not all human minds are constructed in the same way, and some people are more prone to forgetting certain kind of things than others. But let's go and look at cases of forgetting a language so that we can talk about reviving it. I think when we talk about people on the spectrum of forgetting languages or not forgetting languages, I think on the positive scale, people that are unlikely to forget languages are on the polyglot spectrum. Just using myself as an example, my biography is out there. Many decades ago, I studied far too many languages, and I realized after a point that I couldn't continue with them all, and so I consciously said, I'm not going to study these languages anymore, and I put those books on my shelves, books that I'd studied, textbooks that I'd studied thoroughly, but I still have those books, and every couple of decades I might take some of these books down and go through them, and I find when I do that I haven't really forgotten any information. It's dusty, it's rusty, but it's not rotting, it's not molding away, it's still there. And I know from other polyglots, too, who've had similar experiences that when your mind is constantly engaged with learning languages, if you're a scholar of languages, even if you don't work with a particular one, you're working with so many other languages that it is getting some sort of support. And then what I just said, too, I think that if you save your old textbooks, if you make notes in them or take notes and you write things, when you revive stuff, even if you did it 20 or 30 years ago, if you revise it, it's easy to revive something that you have lost then. So just a note for future studies. I would like to talk about some specific cases of people that I know that have forgotten languages and not languages. So we're going to talk about things that you can do so as not to forget them. In 1996, I moved to Korea to study languages. To teach, or study Korean, obviously, but my profession there was teaching, for example, Spanish. I taught Spanish to a group of people, young people from 1996, 97, 98, in like a 3-year period, among whom there were some really excellent students. There was Yoon Chang-nok, who took the name of Ricardo, and Kim Soo-hee, who took the name of Michelle. They were like two of the best students that I had, that I was able to take from they'd have no prior experience with Spanish whatsoever, and I was able to get them to, after 3 years, to be able to read literature, start reading short stories, and discussing them. And so Korean students have the wonderful habit of staying in touch with their professors. And like I said, I think I taught these two particular individuals in 1990, probably about 1999. They probably graduated in 2000, and I left Korea in 2004. And they came to visit me towards the end of that time, I guess when they heard I was leaving. And they came into my office together. And when I saw them together, I naturally started speaking Spanish to them. And what I found was that Ricardo, he wasn't as good as he used to be, but he was still just fine. He could still converse and speak it. Whereas Michelle's Spanish was entirely gone. She wasn't being shy. She wasn't the kind of person that would not talk. She didn't understand, and she couldn't say anything. So these were two students that had learned in the same method with the same person, me, the same teacher, the same thing, and they were both really excellent students. And anything, I would say Ricardo was, he was great in everything that was there, but Michelle was more like the perfect student who never made a single mistake on any test. And yet her language was totally gone. And so we talked about this, and I said, well, Ricardo, how is it that you are still remembering it? He said, well, I've been following the advice that you gave me to think in Spanish by myself when I'm in the shower. And I had given them that advice, particularly guys like him, when they went off to do their military service, they interrupted their schooling to go to this. And I told him, okay, you're not going to be able to keep studying Spanish. You're not going to have anybody to speak with, but you can always speak with yourself. And even no matter how busy you are, you always have, like 5 or 10 minutes by yourself in your head when you're in the shower. So just make a habit of thinking to yourself and speaking to yourself while you're in the shower. And he had done that. And by continuing that habit, his language, as I said, was getting rusty and dusty, but it wasn't withering and going away the way hers was. So there are mental exercises that you can do to prevent yourself from forgetting languages, I think. And this will help also to revise them if that should happen. Some other people that I've known over the course of my career who have really shown that they've totally forgotten languages. When I was in Singapore at the Regional Language Center there, teaching teacher trainers of English from Vietnam, there were a number of people there, and after I got to know them, they told me that they had actually started their professional careers as teachers, not as teachers of English, but as teachers of Russian. Russian sort of fell out of favor. English became more important with changes there, and so they switched to English after a certain point. But when I learned this, I thought, okay, well, I've studied Russian too. I like to try to speak Russian when I meet other people that have studied Russian. So I tried to speak Russian to them, and they could not do it. They could not say or understand more than a few words. They couldn't understand anything. And these are people that had professionally trained in it and been teachers of it and been all of this. And just after like 10 years or so, their language was gone. And I don't know how apocryphal this story is or how really true, but what I've heard is that during the Cultural Revolution in China, the communists would take undesirable intellectuals and just put them in prison, where there's basically their punishment consisted of not having any access to books or to paper or to writing or to anything. And after maybe 10 or 12 years of imprisonment, they would be functionally illiterate. They would be let out, and they would be unable to read or write. Now, that does kind of mirror my experience with Chinese characters. Those are the one kind of things that I've found that when I have had stages of my life when I've tried to memorize 2,000 or 3,000 Chinese characters, and then I haven't done it for a couple of years, and then when I try to do it again, I really need to start all over. And I remember when I lived in Korea, there were many Koreans who could read a given Chinese character, but if I asked them to write it or draw it, they would start and they would not know how to do all the things in the correct order. So there are things that you need to worry about forgetting. So different types of learners and ways that they might need to revive languages that they've forgotten. I think that there are, as I talked about with my son last time, sort of heritage learners, people who might have known a language in childhood, used it at some earlier portion of their life, and then moved on from it. And if it was just a language that they acquired and used naturally, they might find that this is gone, totally gone after a couple of years, and it's something that they need to work on. Another type of person that has problems with language forgetting are sort of burgeoning polyglots, people who are starting out on the path of the polyglot, learning lots of languages, really excited about it, but are still trying to do it in more of a sequential fashion. So they'll work with great passion and energy on one language and for a couple of months, and then stop and move on to another language, and then another language, and then might go back to one of the first languages that they studied and find that they didn't retain it much because they kind of were cramming it in and working very intensively. So, I mean, the cure for there is to work simultaneously, learn sign languages side by side rather than sequentially. But I think the main kind of person that I would hope to help with the kind of advice that I'm giving here and kind of support that I can provide is a kind of person that I have met throughout my life and career. When you go to a cocktail party and you meet a bunch of new people and they learn that you're a language professor, scholar, stuff like this, inevitably somebody comes up and says, hey, I used to know French or German or Spanish or Latin. I used to know some language really well when I was younger, when I was in college. And they used to have a story something like this, that, maybe they started it in high school and then they went to a college that had a 2-year language requirement. And so they figured they'd stick with the same language, and they already had a foundation from high school, and then in college it really took off. It was taught well, and so then they fulfilled the language requirement, but they liked it at this point, and so they had some free electives and maybe took some literature reading courses, maybe minored in majored in the language, maybe had an opportunity to go abroad for a year or semester and really live it. And so I've met people like that who say, yeah, when I was in college, I got really good at language X, but since I graduated, I haven't used it, and I don't have a real opportunity. I know I could reach out and find ways, but I don't use it. And maybe this conversation with you is making me think this, or maybe I picked up a book that I once read and I saw that I'd underlined things, understood it, and now I don't understand it. And now when we're talking about this language, and this language now, and I try to say it, I can't say anything. And so these people at this point kind of, if the conversation is going this way, might be a little bit wistful and sad and frustrated, and maybe I'm provoking this inadvertently by getting them to think about this, and maybe it's not a big issue in their life. But I think that there are probably a lot of people out there who have learned the language in this fashion, studied it systematically at some point, and then realized that they've let it slip away, or they've let it slip mostly away, and would like to have that not be the case. And so if that does apply to you, if you're thinking that sounds like me, in terms of reviving it, I would say the first thing is to don't despair. No matter how bad it seems right now that you can't formulate a single thought, or you pick up an old book that you read once and you don't understand anything, the situation is probably not as bad as you think. We don't really forget knowledge like this. It seems to go away. It's almost universal reports that I've had from people who've said, I thought I didn't have the language anymore, but once I went to the country and I found myself totally surrounded by it, immersed by it, it started to come back. And it started to come back like in leaps and bounds. Maybe it never got to where it was, depends on how long I was there. But if you find yourself surrounded by it again, you'll realize, you're waking up neurons in your brain that seem to have gone long dormant. But that said, if you have not used a language for 5 or 10 years, and you're starting to use it again, and if you are not in a position, like most people aren't, to just sort of go and immerse yourself totally in it again, you may have to relearn it. You may have to restudy it. You may have to go over it again. It's probably a good idea to be really firm in your knowledge of structure and grammar and vocabulary and all that. But if you have to restudy it again, even if you did find studying the first time to be something of a chore and a burden, you probably won't this time. It'll definitely be much easier to relearn it, to revise it, and go through it again. Particularly if you're lucky enough to have your original textbooks with you, where you have any of your old notes that will come back. Once you've studied it, and once you have gotten the it got the juices flowing again, obviously the more exposure you can get to it, the better. There are many ways you can find a conversation partner, language exchange type thing these days. Certainly all sorts of media, particularly not just listening to music. People like to sing along with music or watch movies with subtitles, things like this. This is all very good. The more exposure you can get to that, you'll be fine. But As always, I just have to come down with my professional prejudice on the side of not just texts, not just reading, but books, good books, literature, things that's been well written, as I think of being really the best way to learn any language, and certainly to revive a language that you have forgotten. Because more than anything else, you're looking at a sentence that's been not just written, but crafted by somebody who's gone over it and edited it, and you have an interesting culturally relevant story, probably, if you've got a book in front of you. But that whole experience of being able to mull over the text, look at the word, look at the sentence, see how these are, that will definitely, I think, do more to revive your knowledge of a language than just hearing it, or hearing it go by in a song or in a movie or something. So sitting and looking at a text, I think, is unquestionably the best way of revising a language. And the best way of looking at a text is what I would definitely advocate is as the I don't know, it's in the Assimil methods, it's in other kinds of things that I always talk about, but I think that bilingual texts are such a key to effective language learning in so many ways that it's amazing that there are not more of them out there. There's no dearth of them. You can find them. And if you've forgotten, even if the language is not related, say it's Italian and English or Russian English or something, if you have a text where even if you feel like you've forgotten everything, but you have the English translation on the one side and you have the text that you want to understand and maybe you could understand at some previous point in your life, you can progressively use that bilingual text and wean yourself off of it. You can start out by comparing sentence by sentence and then maybe read the English paragraph and then the target language paragraph, and then maybe a whole page and a whole page, and then ultimately sort of wean yourself away from reading the English text first, but just refer to it when you need to, and ultimately come to the point when you are when you're reading, you don't need a bilingual text to read. You can just pick up a book and start to read it. And at that point, again, if you had the experience, particularly of being this sort of college-educated person who let a language slip away one time, think about it. You learned it because you had a bit of structure, you had a kind of class, you had an environment in which to use it. So to avoid that happening again, if you could possibly find some sort of discussion group where you could have a text that you read and discuss with other people who are doing the same thing, that gives you the conversation that you need and also a focus of information. So reviving a language is definitely easier than learning it the first time, and these are ways that you can do it. Now let me get back to that statement that I made at the beginning of the video, that as a native English speaker, you personally, listener, you have forgotten a language so thoroughly you don't even know what it is. And the same is true of French speakers and of German speakers and of many speakers of languages that have long literary traditions. And what I'm talking about are some of the earlier historical forms of the language. Language is a living thing that grows and changes just like people do. And we actually, right now, we're not just speaking and using English, we're speaking modern English, living contemporary English. And scholars, we can break English into various historical parts. I think most people have looked at the King James Bible or Shakespeare, both of which are written about 1617, 1620, and know that this language from 400 years ago, it's intelligible, but it's really weird. It's strange. And if you push it back another 100 years to William Tyndale's biblical New Testament translation of 1526, that's even 100 years before that, so 500 years ago, before now. That's still considered modern English, the same form of the language that we're speaking, but it's quite different, but it's intelligible. And definitely, if you were just to pick that book up and try to walk around with it, it would be a little bit difficult. But if you had a modern translation side by side with it and you looked at the two of them, the process of learning, quote unquote, or becoming familiar, being able to read an earlier historical form of your own language is much more similar to the process of reviving a language that you've forgotten than it is to learning a new language. There's different forms, there's different words, there's different meanings. Yes, it would help to get an overview of the grammar at some point. But when you have a language like English that has a long history, so we have modern English back to about 1500, and then we have Middle English for a couple of hundred years in the Middle Ages, and then we have what's called Old English or Anglo-Saxon that comes before that. You, as a contemporary speaker of modern English, if you tried to do this with, say, Modern English and Anglo-Saxon, that's different enough that you might have a harder time doing that. But if you did it with Modern English to Middle English, and then you became versed in Middle English, and then you could do Middle English and Old English, I think you could repeat this process quite well. So the historical forms of our language are, there's sort of arbitrary cutoff dates, are historical events that mark certain events, but we grow accustomed to the forms that we have and use, but it's still the same language in an altered shape and altered form. And again, to get Platonic about it, Plato's idea of remembering as learning as remembering, or just to make the analogy, if you compare and contrast the experience of learning a different language, where you really need to study the structure and stuff beforehand before you can hope to read it, with the experience you can have of taking a bilingual text to look at an earlier historical form of your own language, that's much more akin to reviving. So I hope this was interesting and useful to you, and thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again next week.